An orphaned little boy shows up at a billionaire CEO's office, claiming the man to be his biological father. But when a DNA test is ordered, the CEO and the boy freeze in shock at the result, and at what it means for their future. Adrian Blackwell's office was a sanctuary of order. Perched on the top floor of a gleaming skyscraper, it overlooked the pulse of the city, a fitting backdrop for a man who had built an empire from nothing. His staff moved with military precision, aware that even the slightest misstep could draw the ire of their demanding boss. Adrian himself sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, his dark suit tailored to perfection, his gaze fixed on the multiple screens that charted the lifeblood of his company. It was just another Monday morning, until it wasn't. The interruption came in the form of a knock at the door, followed immediately by the entrance of his assistant, Carla, her usually unflappable demeanor uncharacteristically shaken. "Mr. Blackwell," she began, her voice unusually tentative. "There's a situation." Adrian glanced up, irritation flickering in his sharp blue eyes. "What kind of situation?" Before Carla could respond, the door swung open again, and a boy, small, scruffy, and utterly out of place, marched into the room. His clothes were too big for him, his sneakers scuffed beyond repair, and his brown hair stuck out at odd angles. Despite his disheveled appearance, his expression was one of defiant determination. "Hey, Mr. Blackwell," the boy said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "You're my dad." Adrian blinked, the words so unexpected that, for a moment, he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. Carla's mortified gasp confirmed it. "Excuse me?" Adrian's tone was icy, the kind he reserved for competitors foolish enough to challenge him. "My name's Lucas," the boy said, stepping closer and pulling a crumpled piece of paper from his pocket. "My mom's name was Emily Carter. She's gone now. And you're my dad." Adrian stood, towering over the boy, his disbelief giving way to annoyance. "Carla, who let this child into my office?" "He slipped past security," she stammered. Don't bother," Adrian snapped, his gaze returning to Lucas. "Whatever scam you think you're running, it ends now. Get out." Lucas didn't move. Instead, he thrust the paper toward Adrian. It was a birth certificate, worn and smudged, but unmistakably official. Adrian's name was listed in the space for the father. "You're not even going to look at it," Lucas challenged, his voice rising. "My mom told me about you. She said you were too busy building your company to care about us, but now she's gone, and I don't have anywhere else to go." The accusation stung more than Adrian cared to admit, but he refused to show it. "Emily Carter," he repeated, rolling the name around in his mind. It sounded familiar, but vague. He'd had plenty of fleeting relationships in his youth, most of them forgotten as quickly as they'd ended. "I don't know what your mother told you," Adrian said, his voice cold and detached. "But I'm not your father. That birth certificate is fake, and if you're looking for a payout, you've come to the wrong place." Lucas's face flushed with anger and desperation. "It's not fake. You think I want money? I just want to know where I come from. I deserve that much." The room fell silent, the boy's words hanging heavily in the air. Adrian could feel Carla's eyes on him, her expression a mixture of pity and disapproval. Outside the office, a commotion began to build, the murmur of voices and the click of camera shutters. "Great," Adrian muttered. "The vultures are here." Lucas turned to the window, where reporters were gathering on the street below. "They followed me," he said quietly. Of course they had. A billionaire CEO being confronted by a supposed long-lost child was the kind of scandal that sold headlines. Adrian's PR team would have a field day spinning this. "Fine," Adrian said at last, his tone clipped. "You want to know the truth? We'll get a DNA test. That should settle this nonsense once and for all." Lucas looked up at him, a flicker of hope in his wide eyes. "Really?" "Yes, really," Adrian replied, already regretting the decision. "Carla, contact the lab. I want this expedited." "Right away, Mr. Blackwell," she said, shooting Lucas a small, encouraging smile before leaving the room. Adrian leaned against his desk, arms crossed, and stared at the boy who claimed to be his son. Lucas met his gaze unflinchingly, his chin jutted out in defiance despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "Until we have the results," Adrian said, his voice low and firm. "You stay away from me, my office, and my people. Do you understand?" Lucas nodded, his confidence faltering for the first time. "I just want to know the truth." "So do I," Adrian replied, though the thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Carla returned moments later, escorting Lucas out of the office and down to the waiting car that would take him to the lab. As the door closed behind them, Adrian exhaled deeply, rubbing his temples. This was a complication he didn't need, a distraction from the carefully curated life he built. Yet, as he sat back at his desk, he couldn't shake the memory of Lucas's face, or the name Emily Carter, now echoing in his mind like a distant, unfinished story. For the first time in years, Adrian felt the uncomfortable tug of doubt. And he hated it. Adrian paced in his office, unable to focus. The usual buzz of his high-powered empire carried on around him, but his mind was elsewhere. The memory of Lucas standing in front of him, small, defiant, and desperate, was difficult to shake. He could still hear the boy's voice. "I just want to know where I come from." He hated how it lingered. It was just a matter of time, he told himself. The DNA test would settle everything, and this whole mess would be over. The lab promised results within the week, and Adrian's PR team had already begun crafting statements, preparing to frame Lucas's story as a sad misunderstanding rather than a scandal. But as much as Adrian tried to focus on his meetings, his stock reports, and his carefully curated image, something gnawed at him. The boy's resemblance to him was uncanny. It wasn't just the green eyes. It was the way Lucas had stood, the same stubborn tilt of the chin that Adrian himself had as a child. Emily Carter's name also refused to fade. Flashes of memory came back to him unbidden, her quick wit, her warm laughter, the way she had looked at him as if she saw a better version of him than he'd ever seen in himself. Their relationship had been brief, cut short by his relentless ambition, but it had been real. Could she have had a child without telling him? The test results arrived on the 7th day, delivered by Carla in a sealed envelope. She handed it to him with an unreadable expression, then quickly left the room, sensing his desire for privacy. Adrian stared at the envelope for a long moment before finally tearing it open. He scanned the results, his eyes catching on the single line that mattered: paternity excluded. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Relief washed over him, swift and undeniable. This boy wasn't his responsibility. The truth was on paper, and it was conclusive. He called Carla in. "Get Lucas back here," he said. "I'll tell him myself." Carla hesitated. "Are you sure, Mr. Blackwell?" No," he interrupted. "I'll handle it." An hour later, Lucas was back in his office. His clothes were still the same, slightly cleaner, but the stubborn determination in his eyes hadn't wavered. "Well?" Lucas asked, crossing his arms. Adrian set the paper down on his desk. "The test results are back. You're not my son." For a moment, Lucas just stared at him, as if the words didn't make sense. Then his face crumpled, his fists clenching at his sides. "You're lying," he said, his voice trembling. "You're just saying that to get rid of me." Adrian sighed, the irritation creeping into his tone. "The results don't lie, Lucas. I'm sorry, but you're mistaken." "My mom wasn't lying!" Lucas shouted, his voice cracking. Tears brimmed in his eyes, but he refused to let them fall. "She told me about you. She told me you'd deny it because you didn't care about us." Adrian's chest tightened at the accusation, but he didn't respond. He didn't know what to say. Lucas reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, faded photograph. He slammed it onto Adrian's desk, his tears finally spilling over. "That's her," he said, his voice shaking. "That's my mom. You tell me you don't know her." Adrian picked up the photo, and the world seemed to tilt slightly. There she was, Emily Carter, younger than he remembered but unmistakable. She was smiling, her arm around a young child who must have been Lucas. For a moment, Adrian was silent, his thumb brushing over the edges of the photo. A wave of something, regret, guilt, confusion, washed over him. He placed the photo back on the desk. "I knew her," he admitted quietly. "But that doesn't change the results." Lucas snatched the photo back, his anger giving way to despair. "You're lying," he whispered again, shaking his head. "I don't believe you." Adrian opened his mouth to respond, but Lucas was already moving toward the door. "You don't care," Lucas said over his shoulder, his voice filled with bitterness. "She was right about you." The door slammed behind him, leaving Adrian alone in the silence. Carla appeared a moment later, looking concerned. "Should I call someone to escort him out?" Adrian shook his head. "No. Let him go." For the rest of the day, Adrian tried to focus on his work, but his mind kept drifting to the photograph. He couldn't deny that Emily had been an important part of his life, even if only briefly. And Lucas. There was something about him that didn't feel like a lie. The PR team, however, was already celebrating. The negative headlines they'd feared were avoided, and the story would be buried within days. That evening, Adrian found himself alone in his penthouse, staring at the city lights through the floor-to-ceiling windows. He poured himself a drink, but the usual satisfaction of a job well done eluded him. He couldn't shake the sound of Lucas's voice, the raw emotion in his words. "You're lying. She was right about you." Adrian closed his eyes and exhaled slowly. He didn't know why the boy's accusation stung so deeply, but he knew one thing: this wasn't over. Not for him. The city skyline stretched endlessly before Adrian's penthouse, a view most would envy. But tonight, it was a blur of lights and shadows, offering no solace. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. He had done what was expected of him, what the DNA test confirmed was true. Yet Lucas's tear-streaked face and defiant words haunted him. There was a conviction in the boy that Adrian couldn't dismiss. Lucas wasn't a liar. If anything, he seemed to believe the truth of his own claim more deeply than Adrian believed the results in front of him. And then there was Emily. Seeing her picture had stirred something dormant within him, memories of her warmth, her kindness, her unwavering belief in people, even him. The idea that she might have kept a child from him felt both impossible and somehow painfully plausible. The timing lined up too perfectly to ignore. Adrian set his glass down with a sharp clink and ran a hand through his hair. He wasn't a man prone to doubts, but this time, they gnawed at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. The next morning, he strode into his office, his usual commanding presence amplified by his sleepless night. Carla barely had time to greet him before he barked out a command. "Call a meeting with PR. I want answers." Carla hesitated, her brow furrowing. "Sir, about Lucas?" "Yes," Adrian said, his tone leaving no room for debate. "Now." Within the hour, his senior PR team gathered in the sleek conference room, their expressions carefully neutral. Adrian's piercing gaze swept over them, his presence dominating the space. "You've all read the test results," Adrian began, leaning forward on the table. "So why does it still feel like something's not adding up?" A murmur of confusion passed through the team, but his PR chief, Melissa Grant, quickly spoke up. Melissa was a sharp, composed woman with a reputation for managing crises with surgical precision. "Mr. Blackwell," she said smoothly, "the results are clear. The boy isn't yours. We've ensured the media has no grounds to pursue this story further. From a PR standpoint, the matter is resolved." Adrian's eyes narrowed. "I didn't ask for a PR summary, Melissa. I'm asking if there's any chance something went wrong at the lab with the test. I need certainty." Melissa's expression didn't falter, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, hesitation maybe? She adjusted her blazer and replied, "The test was handled by a reputable lab. There's no reason to doubt the results." Adrian leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze fixed on her. "No reason to doubt? Or no reason to revisit, for fear it might complicate things?" Be honest with me, Melissa. For the first time, Melissa's polished facade cracked, her jaw tightening. Sir, with all due respect, revisiting this could open a can of worms. The boy's claims have already generated media attention. If it turned out the results were different, or if anyone perceived doubt on your part, it could lead to significant damage to your reputation. You've built an empire on precision and control. A personal scandal could undermine everything. Adrian studied her in silence, his mind racing. The logic was sound, the strategy impeccable, exactly what he had come to expect from Melissa. But it didn't sit right. The careful phrasing, the insistence on avoiding complications, it felt less like reassurance and more like deflection. Are you saying there's something to hide? He pressed, his voice low but dangerous. No, of course not, Melissa replied quickly, too quickly. I'm saying it's better to leave this behind us. The boy isn't yours, and there's no benefit in reopening the matter. Adrian nodded slowly, but the flicker of doubt in her eyes was all he needed to see. You're dismissed, he said abruptly. Melissa hesitated, as if weighing whether to push back, but ultimately rose and left the room with the rest of the team. Adrian stayed behind, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the city. Something wasn't right. He could feel it, a nagging sense that he was being managed, steered away from the truth. His thoughts returned to Lucas and the photo of Emily. He couldn't shake the feeling that the boy was his. It wasn't just the resemblance, it was Emily's eyes, staring back at him through Lucas's tear-streaked face. That evening, Adrian called the lab directly. The DNA test had been arranged through his PR team, and while he'd signed off on it, he hadn't been involved in the details. Now, he wanted answers. The lab technician who answered his call was polite but cautious, citing confidentiality protocols. It wasn't until Adrian invoked his legal team that the technician reluctantly agreed to review the case. There's something strange in the records, the technician said after a long pause. The sample you provided came with special instructions to ensure expedited results. What kind of instructions? Adrian demanded. The chain of custody, the technician replied carefully. It wasn't standard. The results were flagged as urgent and were finalized without the usual verification process. Adrian's jaw tightened. Who issued those instructions? After another pause, the technician said. The request came from your PR team. Specifically, someone named Melissa Grant. Adrian's hand gripped the phone tighter. His suspicions were no longer just paranoia. They were rooted in something real. I want the original test rerun immediately, he said, his voice cold as steel. I'll make the arrangements, the technician replied nervously. Adrian hung up and leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Melissa had gone behind his back. She hadn't just managed the situation, she had manipulated it. And if the original results were tampered with, that meant Lucas might actually be his son. For the first time in years, Adrian felt something unfamiliar, fear. Not for his reputation, but for what he might have lost because of someone else's deception. Lucas had been right to call him a liar, but the truth was far worse. Adrian didn't just owe the boy an apology. He owed him the truth, whatever it turned out to be. Adrian sat in his office long after the city lights had dimmed. The rerun DNA test was underway, but the weight of uncertainty pressed down on him. If Lucas was his son, how could Emily have kept it a secret? Or had she tried to tell him, only for her voice to be silenced by others? The thought gnawed at him, and the image of Lucas, angry, heartbroken, yet unyielding, kept surfacing. Adrian had spent his life controlling every aspect of his world, but now he faced something he couldn't ignore or dismiss. The next morning, fueled by determination, Adrian began digging into Emily's past. He'd ordered his private investigator to gather all available information. By the afternoon, a file arrived on his desk, thick with documents, photographs, and notes. Emily Carter had passed away in a car accident just months earlier, the report said. She'd been driving late at night, likely exhausted after a double shift at the small diner where she worked. She died on impact, leaving Lucas, her only son, with no immediate family to claim him. He'd been placed into foster care, bouncing between homes ever since. Adrian's chest tightened as he scanned the details. Emily had lived a modest life, far removed from the luxury he now surrounded himself with. There were photos of her smiling, holding Lucas as a baby, working at the diner. She looked happy, but there was an undeniable weight in her eyes, as though life had asked too much of her too soon. Among the papers was an old address for Emily's apartment. Adrian hesitated for only a moment before deciding to go there. He couldn't explain why, but he needed to see the life she had built, the one he hadn't been a part of. The building was a rundown complex on the outskirts of the city, its paint peeling and its hallways dimly lit. The landlord, a gruff older man, confirmed that Emily had lived there for nearly a decade. She was quiet, paid her rent on time, the landlord said. Shame about what happened. The kid, Lucas, he was always polite, always helping her out. Good kid. Adrian thanked him and left, the landlord's words echoing in his mind. Lucas wasn't just some random child looking for a story. He'd been raised well, despite the odds. His next stop was the diner where Emily had worked. It was small and unassuming, tucked between a laundromat and a hardware store. Inside, the smell of coffee and frying bacon filled the air. When Adrian asked about Emily, the waitress behind the counter called for someone in the back. A moment later, a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and an apron dusted with flour, appeared. You knew Emily? She asked, studying Adrian with a mix of curiosity and caution. I did, Adrian said carefully. I'm trying to learn more about her. And about Lucas. The woman's face softened at the mention of Lucas. I'm Janet, she said. Emily and I were close. I've been worried about Lucas since she passed. Sweet boy. He didn't deserve to lose her. Adrian nodded. Did Emily ever talk about me? Janet frowned, her brow furrowing. She did, actually. She always said Lucas's father was this big-shot businessman. She used to joke that you probably didn't even remember her. Adrian's throat tightened. Did she ever try to contact me? Plenty of times, Janet said. She wrote you letters. I saw her mail some myself. She even sent one certified, just to make sure it got to you. Adrian froze, his mind racing. He'd never received any letters. Not one. His PR team had always been meticulous about filtering his mail, keeping anything deemed irrelevant or intrusive from reaching him. I never got them, Adrian admitted, his voice low. Janet's expression darkened. She thought as much. She said you probably had people who handled things for you. She sighed, shaking her head. She never stopped believing you deserved to know about Lucas, though. Even when things got hard, she told him his dad was someone important. She wanted Lucas to be proud of where he came from. Adrian's heart sank. Emily had tried. She'd wanted him to know. And someone, his own team, no doubt, had made sure he didn't. Thank you, he said quietly, for telling me. Janet placed a hand on his arm. Lucas is a good kid, Mr. Blackwell. He's been through a lot, but he's strong. If you really are his father, don't let him down. The words hit him harder than he expected. He nodded, left the diner, and returned to his car, his mind a whirlwind. That evening, back in his office, Adrian called Melissa into the room. Did Emily Carter ever try to contact me? He asked, cutting straight to the point. Melissa hesitated, her usual composure slipping. Sir, I don't think, answer the question. Adrian snapped. Melissa's lips pressed into a thin line. There were letters, she admitted. A few. But we screened them. They didn't seem credible. We thought you thought? Adrian interrupted, his voice cold. You thought you knew better than me about what was worth my attention? Sir, we were trying to protect you, Melissa said, her tone defensive. You have a reputation to uphold. These things can spiral out of control. Adrian leaned forward, his eyes blazing. Do you have any idea what you've cost me? What you've cost him? Melissa looked away, clearly realizing she'd miscalculated. Find the letters, Adrian ordered. Every single one of them. And get me the updated DNA results as soon as they're in. Melissa nodded stiffly and left the room. Adrian sat back in his chair, staring at the photo of Emily and Lucas that he'd taken from the file. She had tried. She'd believed he was worth the risk. For Lucas's sake, and for Emily's memory, he wouldn't let her down again. Adrian sat alone in his office, the city's glow pouring in through the vast windows. The revelations of the past few days churned in his mind like a storm. Emily had tried to tell him. Lucas had believed in her words with an unshakable certainty. And now, with the lab rerunning the DNA test, the truth felt closer than ever, but also more elusive. He tapped his fingers against his desk, the rhythm betraying his restless energy. His thoughts kept returning to Melissa, to her calculated explanations and her unwavering insistence on protecting him. The idea that his own team, people he had trusted implicitly, might have interfered with something this personal filled him with anger. When the phone rang, it cut through his thoughts like a knife. He snatched it up immediately. "Mr. Blackwell," the voice on the other end said, tentative but clear. "This is Dr. Green from the lab. We've completed the review of the DNA test and, well, there's something you should know." Adrian's grip on the phone tightened. "Go on." "There was an issue with the original test," Dr. Green continued. "The sample we received had been flagged for expedited processing, but the chain of custody shows irregularities. The sample was relabeled during transfer, and the original results may have been altered." Adrian's breath caught. "Are you saying the first test was falsified?" "I'm saying the results you were given don't match the ones we just obtained," Dr. Green replied carefully. "The updated test confirms that you are, in fact, Lucas's biological father." For a moment, Adrian couldn't speak. His chest tightened as the weight of the revelation settled over him. "Send me everything you have," he finally said, his voice cold and controlled. "Every record, every detail. Now." "Yes, sir," Dr. Green said before the call ended. Adrian sat back in his chair, his hands gripping the armrests. The truth had been buried, deliberately. And he was going to find out who was responsible. Moments later, Melissa was summoned to his office. She entered with her usual air of confidence, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Blackwell?" she asked, closing the door behind her. Adrian gestured for her to sit but didn't wait for her to get comfortable. He slid the lab report across the desk, his expression as cold as steel. "The DNA test was positive," he said flatly. Melissa blinked, her calm demeanor faltering. "That's surprising." Adrian's eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me. I know the original results were altered. The lab confirmed discrepancies in the chain of custody, all tied back to my PR team. So tell me, Melissa, what did you do?" She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her carefully constructed mask beginning to crack. "Sir, we were acting in your best interests. When the initial results came back positive, we thought it would be better to manage the situation preemptively." "Better?" Adrian repeated, his voice rising. "Better for who? For me? Or for your team, so you wouldn't have to deal with a story you couldn't control?" Melissa leaned forward, her tone defensive. "You've built an image, Mr. Blackwell. You're a powerful, untouchable figure in the business world. A surprise like this, an unknown child, could have been a PR disaster. We made a calculated decision to protect you." Adrian stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "You didn't protect me," he said, his voice icy with anger. "You robbed me of the truth. You robbed Lucas of a father. And you insulted Emily's memory in the process. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Melissa opened her mouth to respond but hesitated, clearly aware there was nothing she could say to undo the damage. Adrian loomed over the desk, his fury barely contained. "How many times have you filtered my life? How many decisions have you made for me without my knowledge?" Melissa looked away, guilt flashing across her face. "We've always acted with your best interests in mind," she said quietly. "Get out." Adrian snapped. You're fired. And don't think for a second I won't be investigating every action you've taken in my name. She hesitated, as if she might plead her case, but the look on Adrian's face silenced her. She rose and left the office without another word. The silence that followed was deafening. Adrian sank back into his chair, his anger giving way to a crushing sense of regret. He had trusted his team to protect him, but their interference had cost him something far more valuable than his reputation. Later that evening, as he sat in his penthouse, Adrian went through the letters Janet had found, now retrieved from his PR team's archives. Emily's handwriting was neat but emotional, her words filled with hope and longing. Adrian, one letter began, I know you're busy, and I know this may not seem important to you, but I think you deserve to know you're a father. His name is Lucas, and he has your eyes. He's bright, kind, and stubborn, just like you. Please don't ignore this. He deserves to know where he comes from. Adrian swallowed hard, his vision blurring as he read letter after letter. Emily had believed in him, even when he didn't deserve it. And Lucas had clung to that belief, despite everything. The weight of his own failures pressed down on him, but this time, he wouldn't let it crush him. He had a chance to make things right, for Emily, for Lucas, and for himself. Adrian picked up his phone and made a call. Carla, get me everything I need to find Lucas. I don't care how late it is. I need to see him. Tonight. For the first time in years, Adrian felt something more powerful than ambition driving him forward, the need to be the man Emily believed he could be, and the father Lucas deserved. Adrian's driver navigated the quiet streets with urgency, the city lights blurring past the windows of the sleek black car. Adrian sat in the back seat, clutching the folder of Emily's letters like a lifeline. Carla had managed to track down Lucas's current foster placement, but the news wasn't promising. Lucas had run away 2 days ago, and no one had seen him since. Adrian's heart pounded as he stared out the window, searching for any sign of the boy. The guilt weighed heavily on him now, knowing the truth and realizing how deeply he had failed Lucas already. Where to next, sir? The driver asked, his voice tentative. Adrian's mind raced. Then he remembered Emily's favorite park, the one Janet had mentioned when they spoke at the diner. It was a place she used to take Lucas when he was little, a quiet spot with a pond and a scattering of benches. If Lucas had nowhere else to go, perhaps he'd found his way there. The park, Adrian said firmly, leaning forward. Get us there as quickly as possible. The car pulled up to the park a short while later, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Adrian stepped out into the cool night air, his gaze scanning the shadowy expanse. The park was quiet, almost eerily so, save for the soft rustle of leaves and the breeze. He walked slowly, his shoes crunching against the gravel path. His eyes searched every bench, every tree, every corner, until finally, he spotted a small figure huddled on a bench near the pond. Lucas. The boy sat with his knees drawn to his chest, his small frame illuminated faintly by a nearby street lamp. He clutched a photograph in his hands, staring at it as though it held the answers to all his questions. Adrian's breath caught. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure how to approach. But then he took a deep breath and forced his legs to move. Lucas, he called softly, his voice breaking the stillness. The boy's head snapped up, his wide eyes filled with both fear and defiance. What are you doing here? Lucas demanded, his voice hoarse. Adrian stepped closer, keeping his movements slow and deliberate. I've been looking for you, he said gently. I needed to talk to you. Lucas's grip on the photograph tightened. Why? So you can tell me I'm wrong again? So you can say it's all a mistake? No, Adrian said quickly, his voice firm but warm. I was wrong, Lucas. About everything. I didn't know the truth before, but now I do. Lucas frowned, his brows knitting together in confusion. What are you talking about? Adrian hesitated, then crouched down to meet Lucas at eye level. The DNA test, he said. The first one. It wasn't the truth. It was tampered with. The real results came in yesterday, and they proved what you've been saying all along. I'm your father. Lucas stared at him, his expression unreadable. You're lying, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm not, Adrian said, pulling the lab report from his pocket and placing it on the bench beside Lucas. This is the truth. And I'm sorry I doubted you. I'm sorry I let you down. Lucas looked at the paper, his hands trembling as he picked it up. His eyes darted over the words, his breathing shallow. My mom told me, he said finally, his voice shaky. She told me you were my dad, but I didn't think you'd ever believe me. Adrian's chest tightened. She was right about everything, he said softly. And she tried to tell me. She wrote to me, Lucas. She wanted me to know about you, but I never got her letters. People around me. They kept them from me. But I should have been there. For her and for you. I failed both of you, and I'll never forgive myself for that. Lucas's face crumpled, tears spilling down his cheeks. She always said you'd come around one day. She believed in you, even when I didn't. Adrian reached out cautiously, placing a hand on Lucas's shoulder. I'm here now, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And I'm not going anywhere. I promise, Lucas. I'll never abandon you again. For a long moment, Lucas didn't respond. But then, slowly, he leaned into Adrian's chest, his small body shaking with silent sobs. Adrian wrapped his arms around him, holding him tightly as though he might disappear if he let go. They stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, the stillness of the park wrapping around them like a cocoon. When Lucas finally pulled back, his tear-streaked face was filled with a cautious hope. Do you really mean it? He asked. You're not just saying that? I mean it, Adrian said, looking him directly in the eyes. I'm going to make this right, Lucas. Whatever it takes. Over the next few days, Adrian made good on his promise. He arranged for Lucas to leave the foster system immediately, bringing him to stay in his sprawling penthouse. At first, Lucas seemed overwhelmed by the sudden change in his circumstances, the endless rooms, the staff, the sheer luxury of it all. But Adrian worked to make him feel at home, carving out time from his demanding schedule to be there for Lucas in ways he'd never been for anyone else. They spent hours talking, sharing stories about Emily and piecing together the fragments of their shared past. Lucas was wary at first, reluctant to let his guard down, but Adrian's determination and sincerity gradually began to chip away at his walls. One afternoon, Lucas pulled out the photograph he had been clutching at the park. It was a picture of Emily holding him as a baby, her smile radiant despite the modest background. She always said I had your eyes, Lucas said, looking up at Adrian. Adrian smiled, his throat tight. She was right. In those moments, Adrian felt a shift within himself, a new sense of purpose, one that had nothing to do with boardrooms or profit margins. Lucas wasn't just a second chance at fatherhood. He was a chance to honor Emily's memory and prove that he could be the man she believed he could be. And for Lucas, the boy who had lost so much, it was the start of something he had never dared to hope for, a family, and a future where he truly belonged. Adrian found himself waking up earlier than usual, his once meticulously structured mornings now filled with the sounds of a 10-year-old boy adjusting to a new life. Lucas was growing more comfortable in the penthouse, though the initial awe of his surroundings hadn't entirely worn off. Adrian couldn't blame him. He still remembered his own humble beginnings, the shock of walking into luxury for the first time. They'd settled into a kind of routine. Lucas would spend his mornings reading or exploring the massive home, while Adrian carved out time between meetings to check in on him. It was a strange adjustment for a man who had spent years avoiding any semblance of personal life, but it was also oddly fulfilling. One afternoon, Adrian came home early, surprising Lucas in the study. The boy was seated in one of the oversized chairs, a photo album open in his lap. He looked up as Adrian entered, his face a mix of hesitation and curiosity. I found this in the guest room closet, Lucas said, holding up the album. It's yours, right? Adrian nodded, sitting down across from him. The album was filled with old photos he hadn't looked at in years, snapshots from his early days, moments he had long since filed away as distractions from his climb to the top. Lucas flipped to a page featuring a young Adrian standing in front of a rundown apartment building. Is that where you grew up? It is, Adrian said, a small smile tugging at his lips. That was my first apartment. Not much to look at, but it was mine. Lucas studied the photo, then glanced up. My mom said you were always working, even back then. She said you wanted to build something big. Adrian's smile faded slightly. She wasn't wrong. I thought success was everything. I thought it would fix all my problems. Did it? Lucas asked, his voice soft but direct. Adrian hesitated, then shook his head. No. It didn't. Lucas closed the album and looked at him. You know, my mom never cared about money. She just wanted you to know about me. She said. She said you deserved to have a family, even if you didn't think so. Adrian felt a lump form in his throat. Emily's belief in him had been unshakable, even when he hadn't earned it. And now, sitting across from Lucas, he realized how much of his life he had missed chasing something he thought would fill the void. I'm sorry I wasn't there, Adrian said, his voice thick. For her. For you. I can't change the past, but I want to make things right moving forward. Lucas's expression softened, and he gave a small nod. I think she'd like that. Over the next few weeks, their bond deepened. Adrian found himself making time for things he never thought he'd enjoy, teaching Lucas how to play chess, showing him how to navigate the kitchen for more than just a cup of coffee, even taking him to the park Emily loved so much. Lucas, in turn, began to open up. He shared stories about his mother, her laugh, her favorite songs, and the way she always seemed to make the best out of bad situations. He talked about his own dreams, too, how he wanted to be an engineer one day, designing bridges or buildings. You'd be good at that, Adrian said one evening as they sat on the couch, a blueprint Lucas had sketched spread out on the coffee table. You've got her determination. Lucas beamed at the praise, the first time Adrian had seen him smile so freely. But as Adrian embraced his role as a father, the betrayal of his PR team lingered in the back of his mind. Melissa's actions had cost him years with Lucas and denied him the chance to support Emily when she needed him most. One evening, after Lucas had gone to bed, Adrian sat in his study, reviewing the letters Emily had written. Each one was a painful reminder of what he'd missed, and what had been stolen from him. Carla knocked softly on the door before stepping inside. Sir, you've been looking into the team's handling of personal matters, she said. I've compiled everything I could find about their practices over the years. She handed him a thick folder, her expression cautious. Adrian opened it, scanning the contents. It was worse than he'd imagined. Letters, calls, even in-person visits, everything that didn't fit into the PR team's vision of his image had been filtered,